Well, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. Adding fuel to the fire, new information that the Atlanta cop who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks had been reprimanded about a use of force. To quell the protests rocking Atlanta and other parts of America, President Trump is set to sign an executive order on police reform today. But will that be enough to stop the violence? Dale Hurd reports.
New information today that the Atlanta police officer who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks had received a written reprimand in 2017 over use of force involving a firearm. This is the newly released 911 call that led up to the fatal shooting of the 27-year-old Brooks in a Wendy's parking lot.
He's in the middle of my drive-through, ma'am.
Does he appear to have any weapons from where you can see him?
No, I think he's intoxicated.
Here's surveillance and police body cam footage.
You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased! Stop.
As Brooks is running away, you see him point the stun gun he took from officers at Garrett Rolfe, who then fired 3 shots. Brooks later died at the hospital. And that set off protest overnight in Atlanta. Atlanta's mayor has ordered a list of new police procedures.
I'm also requiring de-escalation generally and specifically prior to the use of deadly force.
I thought it was a terrible, I'm not going to compare things, but I thought it was a terrible situation.
The incident comes as the nation has been engulfed in protest over the killing of George Floyd, and Washington is taking action. Democrats have already introduced a police reform bill, and President Trump is expected to sign an executive order on police reforms today. The executive order would incentivize police agencies to adopt best practices on use of force, share information about officers' misconduct, and use social workers in nonviolent situations. Republicans are expected to release a bill on police reform Wednesday. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma is working with Tim Scott on the police reform task force. Senator, what do you think is going to come out of the Senate on this bill?
Yeah, there'll be several things that'll come out. Basic transparency is always needed, but that'll come out of this police reform bill. So if a police officer has their employment records, they move to another place to be able to work, their employment records need to be able to move with them. If there's a use of force, whether that be for severe bodily injury or someone dies in police custody, that information needs to be collected on a national level as well. About 40% of the departments already collect that and turn that into the FBI. We'd like for that to be turned in nationwide. We want people to be able to see what's going on in different law enforcement, and quite frankly, for the good police officers to be able to identify bad police officers that are in their midst that are distracting from the work that's happening there and from the good reputation of people doing law enforcement all over the country. But there'll be about 15 different proposals that will roll out tomorrow in our total package.
Is there a police union that might stand in the way of those reforms?
Well, we're going to talk with the police unions. This has been a challenge that several police officers have actually identified to me, to say that at times a person is actually fired or goes through a process of arbitration. At the end of that arbitration, they're put back on the force, and the other officers that work with them are frustrated because they know that this person doesn't have what it takes to be a good police officer on the street. And so there's a couple of things that we're trying to be able to work through. One is we want to continue to be able to work with unions. The union individuals and all those kind of folks are not our problem. It's the system that they've created on this, where it pushes people back out onto the street that maybe they're not at that spot to be able to be. So we want to get more help to police officers because they deal with very difficult issues all day long. It's not unlikely for a police officer to deal with a domestic violence, to be able to deal with a sexual assault, to be able to deal with a person that's actually trying to steal and be able to run away from them and then go work at a school later on that day. There's a lot of emotion that's built up in that, and we want to make sure that we're helping police officers in every way that we can, but we're also bringing people alongside of them to say, if there's someone in the middle of the group that's distracting from the good work that's happening with law enforcement, we need to help them find a different thing to be able to do.
Can Mitch McConnell and you all get this thing through the Senate and through the Congress by July the 4th? I think that's the deadline you're setting for.
So we're trying to get this through as quickly as we can. Obviously, everything here needs bipartisan support. Democrats have already put out their proposal in the House. There are some areas of common ground there. For instance, there's an anti-lynching section of it that we've worked on together for years. So there's several areas that we're going to find common ground on. The difficulty will be in some of the areas where we don't have common ground, and the hope is to be able to work those things out. We're all trying to get to a result, to be able to help as much as we can across the country, support law enforcement, but to be able to deal with any issues that are out there and to be able to make sure we are de-escalating and that we are finding ways to be able to say there's a better way to serve and protect that's not as violent.
What do you think is causing all of this, well, the civil discord and race relations? Is it the police brutality, or is there something underlying all this that needs to be dealt with?
Yeah, so we have a big challenge, obviously, in America dealing with race because we are actually dealing with race. What's interesting on this is a lot of countries around the world still don't deal with race. People are still very isolated, and there is no desire. People stay separated. In the United States, we are not. We have 400 years of history stacked on top of each other with slavery, with Jim Crow laws, with all different things that deal with race for a very long time to suppress. And now we have worked for decades now to be able to unwind all of that and to be able to give opportunities. We have a lot of people that are very successful in our country that are African Americans. Obviously, we've had an African American president. We have African American billionaires. We have successful leaders in media and sports and in business and in life and family. So there's lots of great examples and great resilience. But there's also individuals that are still pushing down African Americans simply because of preference. So that's something we got to deal with. But that's not something you can vote on. That's families. And what I challenge families on is, has your family ever invited a family of another race into your home for a meal? Just to be able to come over for a meal like friends would. And I'm amazed how many people would say, I'm friendly with people of another race, but I've never developed a friendship with someone from another race. There's never been anyone in your home for a meal from another race. And so it's a simple challenge. The issue of race is a national issue, but it really boils down to families and individuals. If individuals aren't developing relationships with people of other race and developing real friendships, our nation is not developing those kind of friendships. And so I challenge families to be able to develop those relationships so our nation can work on this issue together.
Well, Senator, we applaud your efforts. I appreciate it so much, and thanks for being with us on the 700 Club.
Thank you.
Tremendous initiative. By the way, I want to point out somebody that is... You know, they talk now about defunding the police, and Representative Omar has said something about, well, they want to defund the police. And I have this scripture I want to share with you from the book of Romans. It says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. That's what the Apostle Paul said in the Roman Empire with those terrible Roman emperors. He said the governing authority, now we have no king, no emperor, and the people are the ones who are in charge, and we set up these laws, and police are our agents. And to rebel against them is so wrong. But at the same time, the right of the people to petition their government for redress of grievances shall not be abridged. So we have a right for peaceful protest. And if there isn't a problem, we ought to be able to peaceably solve it. But these riots, this looting and all this business, is wrong, it is ungodly, and it is contrary to what the Bible says. So we believe in peaceful protests and the right of the people to petition their government for redress of grievances. And if you look back at the history of the United States, we started in a revolution against the King of England and oppressive laws that were put in place by the Parliament of England. And we got the whole concept of taxation without representation as tyranny. And I remember Patrick Henry, I wasn't there, but I've read. I'd like to say, oh, Patrick and I were buddies, but I did. Yes. But that marvelous speech, is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of slaves and chains and slavery, forbid it, Almighty God. As for me, I know no course except, that's what he's going to do. Give me liberty or give me death. And we wanted liberty, and I think our people want liberty, but we do not want an oppressive police force, and we certainly do not want racial injustice in this country. And I think that we can get a balance, but we cannot permit this stuff that's going on in Seattle, for example. I saw Mike Huckabee the other day. It was brilliant what he had to say. He said, look, that, what do they call it, that free zone in Seattle, mm-hmm. He said, it's real simple. Cut off their electricity, cut off their power, cut off their sewer, and cut off their internet. And then see how far they're going to survive as this, quote, free nation. But we don't want, again, an armed conflict. But nevertheless, he that resists the authority that is ordained by God is violating God, all right? Well, in other news, the president is sending a warning to former National Security Advisor John Bolton. He says, I'm going to sue you over your new book. And John Jessup is saying, maybe not.
Well, Pat, President Trump says Bolton could face criminal charges if he moves forward with his book's publication next week. Administration officials usually sign an agreement requiring them to submit to a process for vetting books for sensitive or classified information. The president and Attorney General Bill Barr claim Bolton has fallen short.
And we don't believe that Bolton went through that process, hasn't completed the process, and therefore is in violation of that agreement.
Now, Bolton's attorney says his client has spent months working with the National Security Council to avoid publishing classified information. He's accusing the White House of using the process to block the book's release. It is titled The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir, and is expected to paint an unflattering picture of the president's decision-making. Pat?
Well, I don't know what it's going to be, but the thing about Bolton was that he really was right in terms of analyzing the dangers we felt. He wanted bold action over and over and over again, and I think the president had to hold him back. He felt these dictators need to be reined in. We need to take strong action against somebody like King Jong-un and Erdogan in Turkey and others, and the president resisted that. So anyhow, they had that clash, but Bolton is a good guy, but he needs to follow the law like everybody else, and I hate to see him get in trouble because of this book, but if the Attorney General says he hasn't complied, then he's got to comply. It's just one of those things. John?
Pat, critics say the Supreme Court redefined the meaning of sex Monday in a landmark ruling protecting LGBT employees. And as Paul Strand reports, many fear it will also have a profound impact on religious freedom.
The court's ruling says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, which in 1964 meant male or female. But sex now means both your sexual orientation and your gender identity.
They've ruled. I've read the decision, and some people were surprised, but they've ruled, and we live with their decision. That's what it's all about. We live with the decision of the Supreme Court. Very powerful decision, actually. But they have so ruled.
LGBTQ groups are rejoicing. The organization Out and Equal announced the Supreme Court has made its statement. Our bedrock civil rights protections do apply to LGBTQ workers. This is a momentous day for the community. Judicial Crisis Network's Carrie Severino suggested the justices had to really twist the meaning of sex discrimination to include these new categories.
It's very clear that however people might read that today in 2020, that is nowhere near how those words were understood in 1964 and for many decades thereafter.
The case involved homosexuals fired from their jobs and a man who wanted to identify as a woman fired from his job at a funeral home. But the case has broad implications outside the workplace.
Is it going to be discrimination to not use a preferred pronoun? Will employers now be required to cover health care when it comes to different transition-related things? What about religious employers?
Things like bathroom usage. things like whether women's sports can continue to exist as we know it if they're forced to allow men to participate in those same sports. A lot of religious freedom questions.
Alliance Defending Freedom's Kate Anderson represented a women's shelter in Alaska.
It had to allow a biological man who identified as female into the shelter where he would sleep mere feet from women, many of whom had been abused, trafficked, raped. These are women who, because of their past trauma, really couldn't be around a biological male while they slept.
As for people of faith, Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council warned this ruling poses a great threat to religious liberty. And Southern Baptist Convention's Russell Moore predicts years of lawsuits and court struggles. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Paul and Pat, it was a surprise 6-3 ruling with a majority opinion written by Trump appointee Justice Neil Gorsuch.
I'm not quite sure what they were saying. That person was fired because he was homosexual. That's a little different from saying a college has got to have a sports team with males running against females. But like so many things, you know, our society works very nicely if we allow the people to make the decisions. But every time you take that decision-making power away from the people and give it to 5 unelected guys on a Supreme Court, all of a sudden you've got problems. We have the problem with Roe versus Wade. We've had it for years. And over again, you've got all these things. The people say, well, we don't think that gay marriage is a good thing. All across the nation, people didn't want to, but suddenly there was that ruling in the Supreme Court that says, oh, no, we want to legalize same-sex marriage. And suddenly there's a chorus of problems. And here again, I am surprised that Gorsuch and men that were so conservative and Roberts have voted, but I'm not sure the extent of what that ruling means. But does it mean that a university has got to have men running in the track team against women in a so-called women's sport under Title IX?
Well, I think what Paul said is true. There are going to be a lot of legal repercussions.
We haven't begun to see the trouble. Every time they step into something like this and take the power away from the people, you're going to have constant trouble. Roe versus Wade was the opening gun, but then that decision that was made about homosexual marriage, it went against the express will of the people of almost every state in the Union. And now the Supreme Court maybe has done it again. I'm not sure how extensive this ruling is, and later cases will determine exactly what it is. But nevertheless, you just look in horror. How can they do it to us?